story, the wonderful story he told, is that many Jews continued to create stores for the diverse community there. And even though they may not have lived in that part of the city, they worked there, and therefore they were committed, and that is often where you would have this kind of interaction. And when I heard Mr. Harshaw's story for the first time, and he told me Mr. Faust was the owner of the store, I said, my goodness, we have a woman who works at the Hebrew Union College who's worked for us for years and years, and she was married to a man named Faust. Mm-hmm. Remember I told you?
Yeah.
So I went right over to her as soon as I finished meeting him, and I said, Tidge, I said, was Phil related to Abe Faust? She said, oh, yeah, it was an uncle. And I said, well, you got this wonderful story that was just told to me.
Wow.
She said, oh, my, she said,
wow.
I have a picture of the store.
Oh, wow.
So I now had a new acquisition for the American Jewish Archives, and this is
oh, wow.
This is the picture. Now, it's not a part of, course, the beautiful collection that you're going to see, and I don't mean to horn in on the collection that we're viewing today, but it'll go upstairs, and you can see. And I know it would mean something. I told you. Remember, I said I had a present for you.
Thank you.
And this is where literally the story that Mr. Harshaw just told us took place. Wow. And I think that's a very nice way upon which I should end my 5 minutes.
Brilliant.
It just shows how history is really done. It's done through conversation and storytelling. You know, story is the root of history, and it's the storytelling. John told his story, I don't know, 5 weeks ago when we got together. You followed it up. You listened, you followed it up, and then there's greater evidence to all put it all together. That's exactly how the story of a community is put together. So thank you very much. We're going to now move to Terry Grundy. And I think maybe and Terry wants to speak from the podium.
I can't think sitting down.
The thing I would say about Terry is, Terry was a great, close co-worker and friend of Danny Ranselhoff in a way that I'm not sure anybody else beyond Danny's family was. So it is really wonderful to have Terry with us this evening to talk and reflect on the photographs that are part of this exhibit.
Thanks, Dan. I do get to talk about Danny, and I love to talk about Danny, but I realize that I'm in trouble. It's true that we were the best of friends, but I'm also well aware that there are people in this room tonight who knew Danny for many more years than I had the privilege of knowing Danny. So if you ever knew Danny Ranselhoff personally, would you please put up your hand here tonight? All right, well, that's wonderful. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that there are at least a few people in this room who actually are blood kin to Danny or kin to Danny by marriage. I'm looking, I think, at Danny Hoffheimer over there. I think they were cousins. So, you know, it was Danny Ranselhoff who taught me those extremely useful Yiddish words, mushpacha and mehutten. Now, I'm a goy, so I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what they connote, each of them, in terms of kinship, but I certainly came to realize when I moved to Cincinnati and was so warmly welcomed by the Jewish community here that everybody was either mushpacha or mehutten, and that was a wonderful and a precious thing. Danny would be thrilled to know that he was in this show. He was, in fact, a great American 20th century photographer. And that was a very major part of his identity. In my opinion, Danny was not recognized sufficiently for that great gift that he had and for the great photographic gifts that he gave us. He was in some shows. He was very proud of having been in some shows. Some of you may remember a very famous show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I believe it was in 1955, a Stieglitz show called The Family of Man. It was perhaps the most prestigious photographic show in mid-20th century America. Danny was in that show. Thousands of photographers submitted their pictures tens of thousands of photographs. And Danny, I believe, was, if not the only one of the very few photographers who had more than one picture in the Family of Man show. The Episcopal Diocese gave him a wonderful show. I believe that was back in the 80s, wasn't it, Dan, if I'm not mistaken? He was very proud to have been a part of that show, and he would be very proud to know that he was a part of this show. He knew Rosen, he knew Rosenthal, he honored them greatly as photographers. And told me about them. I never had the pleasure of knowing either of those two guys, but he thought very highly of them and their work. I think, however, that Danny would say, were he here tonight, that as honored as he is to be in this show, that probably he was in the wrong show. And let me see if I can explain why. Danny, in spite of the theme of this particular exhibit, which is the photo documentation of Cincinnati neighborhoods, and in particular the West End, Danny never set out to photo document Cincinnati's neighborhoods. Don't get me wrong. Danny knew more of the lore of more Cincinnati neighborhoods than anybody I've ever known, unless perhaps it would be Charles Westheimer, who was as silent as Danny was voluble. But he loved Cincinnati. He tirelessly studied and learned about Cincinnati and taught about Cincinnati, and naturally, that meant that he spent a great deal of time reflecting on Cincinnati's neighborhoods as well. He was well aware that the West End was in many ways the cradle neighborhood for Jewish culture in Cincinnati, told me stories about it, took me to that wonderful cemetery that you heard about a few moments ago. But Danny's concerns were not about neighborhoods and the buildings in neighborhoods. Danny's concerns were about what you see. His concerns were about people, and particularly about the poor who were being stranded and in some cases displaced from great historic Cincinnati neighborhoods. Danny was, besides being a great photographer, a great social worker. And it's the coming together of social work and photography that I think is very, very special. He was aware that he was part of a great tradition of social photography, social documentary photography, and he would frequently mention Jacob Riis, who was a great photographer at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And I'm going to pass around some pictures. There's two pictures from Riis, and I want each side of the audience to get these pictures. Now, don't wait for me, just look at them, and you will see. Let's pass that to the other side. You guys have the version. So you will see why Danny associated himself with the tradition of Jacob Riis. Not long after Jacob Riis, there arose in New York a guy by the name of Lewis Hine. He actually had come from Wisconsin. Lewis Hine was another great social documentary photographer, and Danny felt very close to Lewis Hine and his work as well. So now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to pass around some Lewis Hine pictures. And then, just to be sure that we continue the historical story, there was a great social photography tradition that emerged in the Great Depression. The WPA photographers and the Farm Services Administration photographers, and later on the War Information Organization photographers, including people like Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange. And so I'm going to pass some of those pictures around as well, a Walker picture and a Dorothea Lange picture. And as you look at these pictures, I'm sure you're going to see how deeply influenced Danny was by them. My time is drawing to a close. I do want to just say a couple of things about the West End and Danny's sort of unique take on things. Danny loved gossip and was a great repository of gossip, all kinds of gossip. He took a snarky delight in society gossip, but then don't we all? but he was always a repository of things people said about things in Cincinnati. And he had been very struck by the tragic obliteration of the better part of the West End. He well knew that this neighborhood had become, in fact, also the cradle of African American neighborhood life and culture in Cincinnati. And he was very, very distressed by the obliteration of that neighborhood. And we all know what the principal cause of that destruction was. It was the putting in of the interstate highway, I-75. He told one of those stories that Danny told about two brothers by the name of Lazarus. Oh yes, I mean Fred and I mean Ralph. And they were obviously tracking upon the putting in of I-75. And Fred, who I'm told by Danny was the less bright of the two, said to Ralph one day, well, Ralph, this is really a very good thing because all of those people who live out in the suburbs, all of those people can drive in and shop at our stores. And Ralph looked at Fred and said, yes, Ralph, and all of those people who live in the city can also drive out and shop at suburban stores as well. And of course, that was true. The other thing that Danny said about the West End is a demographic observation and insight. It was done in his typical salty fashion, and I want no succumbing to political correctness here, because Danny meant this with love to all parties concerned. He observed, of course, that after the population of the West End got displaced, that the African American community that had lived there for those many decades started moving. And they started moving out, he observed, the Reading Road corridor. Into what neighborhoods did they move? Avondale, of course. And so Danny conceived of this sort of demographic insight that the story of demography in Cincinnati was the story, at least one story, was the story of blacks chasing Jews, because the blacks moved into that next historic Jewish neighborhood, Avondale, and then the Jews upped and moved out and then the Jews moved a bit further out, and then the blacks followed them out into Roselawn and this and that. So blacks chasing Jews was Danny's way of teaching us the demography of Cincinnati. And he said this he loved being a Jew, and he loved being in the black community, so he meant this with all love. So he was a great demographer, he was a great historian, he was a great photographer, and he was a great social worker. He set out to teach us about the poor in our midst so that we would have the same concern for them that he had. And I don't know, you saw a picture of Anna Bud Ware, a great social worker who had hired Danny at Family Services. He always adored her as the patron saint of social workers and loved to take her picture. I don't know what's happening with the PowerPoint show, but I'm finished now. Thank you very much.
I might say that if you've gone up already to the exhibit, if you haven't, everybody's going to focus on the photographs because that's the center of this. Don't miss the Rolodex that's in the center of the exhibit hall. The problem with these things is that they alphabetize everything, and you just search them. And so if you want to see an old style Rolodex like nobody else in the world had, take a look at that Rolodex. It's huge. And it reveals something about the way Danny's mind worked and about how this city was put together. If you weren't in the Rolodex, you just didn't exist.
Dan, we were afraid after Danny died when we put that in that sculptural wall at United Way that people would take their card out of the Rolodex as a memento of Danny, but we found the exact opposite was true. People would find out they weren't in it and they would add a card because not to be in Danny's Rolodex meant you didn't count in Cincinnati.
So, in all seriousness, pay attention to the Rolodex upstairs. Our final presenter before we open this to questions is Scott Gamfer, who's the director of history collections at the Cincinnati Historical Society Library and Cincinnati Museum Center. Scott and I have worked together for 30 years and is the person who has just kept, collected, and made sure that the sorts of materials that we're able to learn from and enjoy in this exhibit and in so many others really are available to the public. So, Scott?
Well, thank you, Dan. Terry used a word which I thought was interesting, and I want to build on that, which was obliteration of the West End. And what is a wonderful thing that we happen to have with respect to the West End neighborhood is we have a number of documentary collections at Cincinnati Museum Center and the Cincinnati History Library that allow people today, because so much of the West End is gone, even the street grid's different, to go back and take a look at what was there before any of the clearing. And I'm just going to talk about some of these collections, and I believe over my head, Abby can show you, I brought some images just from one of those collections, Kenyon Bar, which I'll talk about in a second. But I wanted to point out something that people forget a lot, which is actually, they talk about the clearing of the West End being I-75 and then the Queensgate development, but actually the first clearing of the West End was when they built Cincinnati Union Terminal. And that was between 1929 and 1933, and a lot of people don't realize that they knocked down over 900 residential and commercial structures in the West End, a lot of them along the axis of McLean Avenue, that sort of north-south corridor there where the Union Terminal, not just the main building, but the other facilities were built. And in our collection, although we don't have photographs of those 900-some structures, we do have the purchase contracts from Cincinnati Union Terminal Company. So we have a nice complete record of what they paid for those properties, who owned them at the time, descriptions of the property, and so on. And that really was the first chunk of the West End to get cleared, and that gets left out. I just want to mention that we do have some documentary evidence of that. In the photograph collections, we have a couple of interesting things. One is the Kenyon Bar collection, and Abby, you could start showing those if you want. Let me describe what this is. The city of Cincinnati, for legal reasons, before the clearing of the West End that was for the Mill Creek Expressway and Queensgate, sent a team into the West End, a photographer and an assistant, and they took photographs of every residential property, every commercial property, every vacant lot. And in every one of those pictures is an employee with a signboard, and it has the date the photograph was taken. They were all taken, I believe, in 1959, and a code number. They then plotted out all of those structures on 22 sectional maps, which we also have in our collection. So we have and I want to get the number right, 3,200 3.5-inch black and white photographs and the associated negatives from that project. And we have the 22 sectional maps. And some of you may know we've been scanning the photographs and putting them on our website. And if you'd like to go look at them after this talk, you can see some of the resources we have. It's at our website. It's library.cincymuseum.org. You go right to the library website. That is a great resource, and with a street grid being different, you can look at the maps and see exactly where everything was located. And we do have the option maybe in the future of doing some sort of interactive map, where you mouse over a structure and you get the photo, something like that. A couple of other resources that we have, of course, the George Rosenthal collection, and I just wanted to mention that there is a part of that collection called the West End Project, and that's what Abby and her staff drew from for this exhibit. But there's a much larger Rosenthal collection, and I think in our collection we have something like 35,000 negatives, about 400 slides, and 5,000 prints. And there's a subgroup called the West End Project. And what that was the Cincinnati Historical Society actually hired George Rosenthal in 1957, so before 57, 58, before the Kenyon Bar photographs were taken, he was paid to go actually take photographs of areas of Cincinnati that were slated for demolition, but he wound up taking most of the photographs in the West End. And he took something like 3,700 photographs of structures in the West End. Now, his photographs are totally different than the Kenyon Bar. Kenyon Bar are documentary photographs, so you're probably seeing some of those over my head. They're not artistic shots. They were to document a structure, document a location. George was given free rein to do whatever he wanted, and what he focused on was really the architecture. He took some pictures of entire buildings, but a lot of it was focusing on interesting architectural details that were in the West End, and of course, there was just a wonderful variety and diversity of architecture in that community. He took these pictures to document that. So we have Rosenthal's 1957-58 photos. We have Kenyon Bar 1959 photos before the clearing. And I wanted to mention something. I talked to a couple people beforehand and said I just discovered something that we have in the collection I think we've had for 4 or 5 years. And I don't know who actually took these photos, but I found 22 or 23 panoramic photographs taken in the West End. They're composite panoramic photos. In other words, they're pieced together from individual images. They are about 3 feet wide and about 10 inches high, and they show blocks in the West End prior to demolition for Queensgate 2. So these are photos from the 1970s. So in addition to the 1950s, we now have these photographs from the 1970s, and they were taken immediately prior to demolition. The windows are boarded up, the people are out of the buildings, a lot of the signs are torn down, but they're wonderful photographs, and you can tell from the cars in there that this is from this later period of Queensgate development. And those, I think, certainly with these other resources we have, are also going to be targeted for eventual scanning, although that's a little bit of a challenge to do that with panoramic photos. But I think it's important because somebody studying the West End can come to our collection, eventually do this online, and here is a pretty complete record of what was there. It's like there's no other neighborhood in Cincinnati where we have that kind of resource, where we have basically a snapshot of what was there before anything was cleared, starting in 1959, 1960. And of course, just finally, I want to mention the Ransohoff collection. Danny took so many photographs, it's almost mind-boggling. One donation he gave us was 28,000 black and white negatives. No prints, black and white negatives. Wonderful photos. Many of the ones that Abby has are in the exhibit are drawn, again, from those 28,000 negatives that Danny took. He took thousands and thousands of slides. Later in his life, before he passed away, he said, he had file cabinets full of slides. He said, I'm going to give you slides. He gave us thousands, 2,000 or 3,000 slides that he had taken. And then we probably have maybe 2,000 8x10 black and white prints that Danny made, some for the Family of Man exhibit, some for other projects that Danny worked on. Wonderful. And just one final funny story about Danny. Danny remembered everything about every photograph he ever took in his head. And if you asked him, if you showed him a strip of photographs, he'd say, yeah, that was July of 1962. I was talking to this guy. He'd tell you a story about it. But nothing was written down. There's nothing written on any of the negative sleeves, nothing. And we had an idea, which was to give Danny a microphone and a tape recorder and say, could you just take one strip of negatives at a time and just say into the recorder, the reference number and then whatever you remember. And I think before Danny passed away, he only did one box of negatives. And it was the only way to get anything down from Danny, and I wish we had started that project a year or two earlier because it was a wonderful resource. But the great thing about the photos, just like all of these resources, they speak for themselves. They're a wonderful resource. And again, what I think Dan mentioned at the very beginning with this exhibit is if you see something in a photograph and you know the story, share that with people. Eventually, I want to get the Ransohoff photographs online too. And again, I think people will tell us, the stories that Danny had in his head, some of that people are going to tell us when they see those photos. So thank you.
Well done. Thank you.
I can't resist saying that's what Scott has just presented here. It's a wonderful reminder of the role that the Cincinnati Historical Society Library plays in this community of saving, documenting, and making available the raw materials that historians and ordinary people can use to understand who we are as a people and as a community. So I want to open this up for questions, stories, thoughts, whatever, and let it sort of go wherever it goes. Okay? Yes. Why don't you stand up? As people ask a question, please stand up. It's up now.
I have a particular interest in a portion of the Kenyon Bar neighborhood. Many years ago, I went to the probate court and found my great-grandparents' marriage license from 1906 or something. And they had the address on there, and they lived at 729 Kenyon Street. Ironically, both of them lived at 729, which I thought was interesting. But anyway, so I've tried to find 729 Kenyon Street. And a couple months ago, I found about this photographic exhibit and the extent to which it was online, and I tried to search what was online and nothing came up. So my question is it possible to search what's not online by address and perhaps find a photograph of a particular address in the
Yes.
Kenyon Bar neighborhood?
Yeah, it's not. I have to apologize. It's not all been scanned and put online yet because it's a work in progress. What is online, you can go to our website, and there's a link for the photograph collections. You click on it, and then just type in Kenyon Bar, and it'll pull up all the Kenyon Bar photos. The ones that are not yet scanned are in the library, and if you come down to the library or call the library and give them an address, we can look. I can't guarantee. It's possible there's a building here or there missing, but odds are pretty good that we have it.
And is it at the Museum Center?
Yes. The Cincinnati History Library and Archives, which is the Historical Society Library, is at Cincinnati Museum Center.
Okay.
Let me tell a story that relates to that. A number of years ago, when I was vice president at the Museum Center, I was doing a story for Channel 12 on the West End. And a man by the name of Gene Vinegar, who worked at the Museum Center on the security staff, had grown up in the West End. I always was talking to him about the West End. So I wanted to use him as the person that would tell the story that I wanted to tell. So I took him over to the corner where I knew he had grown up, which was, by that time, had turned into where our collections building was, over on West 5th, and he told me about that, and then we took him someplace else. And then I took him back to the library, and we had the Kenyon Bar collection out, and this was all a setup by me. I mean, I knew what was going to happen. And we pulled out the address of the building that had been on that West 5th Street property before it was torn down, and his first reaction is,